Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP for Alumni Relations at Lehigh, and I'm thrilled that you're with us today on this Mountain Talk with Associate Professor from the College of Arts and Sciences, Anthony DiMaggio. He's here to talk to us about the cancel culture. Anthony has written 9 books, got his PhD from the University of Illinois, and is excited about leading this very timely topic. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about the choreography of how we run these mountain talks. Because there are so many of you on, we have about 54 people and counting. We do ask you to use the chat to ask your questions and make your comments. It's just there, right there at the bottom of your screen. Just click the chat and a box will come up. You can either address just the panelists or the panelists and attendees. If it's just panelists, then only Anthony and I will see the questions. If you do all attendees, then everyone will see your comment. And I do recommend that because it's fun to see the back channel and what other people are saying and asking. So you type that in and then I will ask Anthony the question so that he doesn't have to both read and answer. We are recording this, so if you have to jump off early, we will send you the recording so you can watch it later. With that, let's get started. Anthony will talk to us for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for the rest of the time. All right,
Hey.
Professor DiMaggio.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for logging on. I appreciate it. For people who are interested, the links that were posted. So if you want like a longer, detailed sort of analysis of my take on this discourse of the cancel culture, you can take a look at the essays I wrote within the last couple of months on Counterpunch magazine. And so basically I'm interested in this topic because in particular, what it says about academia, when you hear this discussion about the cancel culture, there's this really rapidly emerging national narrative that targets not just academics, but the media, Generation Z, young people who are protesting. And there's this narrative that's been created that like these groups or these institutions have become like hotbeds of radicalism and intolerance. And one thing that I think is worth pointing out, because I teach a class about the history of social movements in America, is that this is sort of a recycled narrative from about a half a century ago. If you go back to the 1960s and you look at a lot of the backlash against 1960s era protests, you know, including protests against sexism with the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and protests against racism, and anti-war protests with the Vietnam War. There was this very strong backlash on the part of many conservative and right-wing Americans that basically said that these people were intolerant troublemakers who were trying to undermine confidence in American institutions. And the intolerance part was really important because that part of the narrative has really been, it's made a comeback with this attack on higher ed. And so, you know, this sort of got new life with a letter recently that was signed by a bunch of academics to Harper's Magazine called A Letter on Justice and Open Debate, which basically took issue with this alleged cancel culture. And it basically said that there was too much calling out going on of intellectuals and public figures and academics and too much of an effort to deplatform various public figures for controversial statements, people getting fired from their jobs in academia and elsewhere. And basically what these letters for the Harper's, what these authors for the Harper's Magazine letter said was we needed more tolerance and free exchange of information and ideas, an robust and even caustic counter speech, they said. And so basically what they were saying here was that they're making some kind of pluralism argument, that we just need as open of an exploration as possible of different points of view, and that's how we'll get to a better understanding of truth and have a more productive discussion on different sort of important political issues of the day. And the problems that I have, to be really short with this, to summarize, number one is that the message came off as sort of incoherent because there were so many different people who signed this letter who have very different understandings of what they were mad about and what they thought free speech meant, that all it really did was raise more questions than it solved or answered. So it didn't actually clarify anything because there were so many different people from so many different perspectives that it wasn't clear what they were saying because the letter was so vague and sort of anodyne and generic in terms of the language. Also, a second problem, I think that one thing that comes up when you hear this discussion about cancel culture applied to academia is that there is simultaneously a sort of romanticization from the academics who signed that letter about how they think that the academic world operates, which is to say that they're a little too generous in how they think that this is a pluralistic system. And I really devote some time in my pieces to talking about how that's not the case. For example, in the areas that I study, propaganda studies, social movements. These are things that most academics historically, in political science particularly, they really don't like to talk about them because they're seen as outside of the mainstream. Studying social movements and protest, it's seen as very non-mainstream. Studying this idea that America may be defined in various periods in our history and even today through propaganda is something mainstream academics have historically liked to avoid. These are seen as topics that are taboo or too critical. So, from my own experiences, like I don't see a lot of pluralism, particularly in the areas that I study. So I think it's too much of a romanticization of the status quo. And at the same time, it's a little too critical of students because, I've been teaching for 15 years now. I've taught thousands and thousands of students across 5 different universities and colleges, more than 120 different courses in that time. I have yet to encounter what they're talking about in this letter and this idea of a cancel culture where students are so intolerant of professors that they protest when they disagree and they demand these professors be fired. And I've just never seen this in 15 years. So there's a risk here that we may be blowing some of this out of proportion too much because this is stuff that makes for wonderful headlines on the rare occasions when it happens. But if you talk to professors, typically from my experiences, my own personal ones, and from talking to other professors, I just don't see it very often. It's pretty rare. Final issue is we have to be careful in this era referred to as the post-truth era about this idea of open discourse where any view should be explored, because to be honest, there are a lot of people who make bad faith arguments. They don't have an interest in engaging in actual evidence-based argumentation and reasoning. They're more than happy to use hateful rhetoric, rhetorical claims instead of arguments. And so one challenge that ends up coming up is that if there's no filter on who you're willing to discuss things with in debate, things could go sideways very quickly if you deal with people who have bad faith arguments. Now, nobody ever says they engage in a bad faith argument, but people just do it. And we sort of have this rampantly today as a problem. If rampantly is a word, I'll make it up because I'm an academic. I'm allowed to do that, I guess. We have anti-vaxxer claims about coronavirus being a conspiracy that was created by elites like Bill Gates and medical researchers who've exaggerated it. These QAnon conspiracies, Pizzagate about how the Democratic Party is allegedly trafficking in child sex slaves and they're pedophiles who want to eat children and they're satanic and these crazy conspiracies. And so the point being, like, if you ever talk to people who engage in these conspiracies, none of them ever say they're engaged in bad faith arguments. And yet you can collectively make a nation dumber by entertaining people who engage in bad faith claims without any sort of filter in terms of discerning between serious arguments and people who just have something to say that's not serious or is in fact toxic or harmful. So I think what we need to do as academics, in my opinion, is we need to sort of try to hold the line in terms of elevating discussions. Not every argument or every claim or every debate is worth having, especially if the individuals engaged in it are not engaged in good faith exploration of arguments and evidence. So I'll sort of leave it there. And I'd really be interested in what other people have to say about, this cancel culture issue. If you have questions, thoughts, and the like.
Yeah, thank you. We actually have some questions that have come in, all good ones so far. From John, some colleges have more of a public reputation for cancel culture, for example, Berkeley, than others. Is there evidence that colleges fall on a spectrum?
Well, that's a great question. I haven't seen any sort of systematic study that goes through different types of colleges and universities. The best that I have seen is in my own research. I've done some aggregate data collection on higher education in general. And so what I found is, I looked at like hundreds of different survey questions about people's political attitudes on all different types of issues. All different types of political issues, hundreds of questions I've looked at statistically to see if it really is the case that people who have higher levels of education, and this includes a four-year degree, let's say, or a post four-year graduate degree, are they really being indoctrinated? Are they really systematically buying into all types of liberal positions on all types of questions. And so what you can actually do in these statistics is you can control for people's self-described ideology, whether they say they're liberal or conservative or moderate, and their own partisanship too. And you can see if it really is the case that people with higher levels of education are systematically more likely to be liberal. And what I found is it's really not the case. Like, people in higher education are actually quite diverse in terms of the people who get a college degree. And that's not surprising if you've been a part of higher education for years. What you notice is that there may be some programs and universities that are known as more liberal, maybe a Berkeley or Evergreen college or those kinds. There are others that are known as more sort of vocational, an MIT, for example, and there's a lot in between, right? So there's a huge amount of diversity and variety in higher education. So it's really hard to speak in any way about an overarching pattern of indoctrination in a liberal sort of way, because we just don't see it in the actual data. It's not the case that people who get college degrees are just one-dimensionally liberal. They're quite a diverse group.
Mm-hmm. Right, and probably change over time based on age and experience.
Definitely.
So Bruce is asking, is Lehigh's poli-sci department exceptional in its willingness to tenure someone working on a taboo topic?
I think so. You know, my experience from looking at the field over many years and just going to conferences, trying to get things published, talking with professors in graduate school, going on job interviews. Lehigh is a pretty exceptional place in terms of political science. I wouldn't call it a leftist department. I would call it a pluralistic department, because we've had a lot of different types of individuals of different ideological persuasions. And it is pretty pluralistic in the sense that there's room for all different types of things. So it's pretty unique in the sense that I don't, like when I applied for the job here, you know, it said we want someone who studies social movements, propaganda, and like that was like the only job literally in the whole country that had that kind of description I've seen in 10 years. So yeah, it would be an exception to the rule, because what I've been describing is not the norm at most places. Most political science is interested in electoralism, not social movements. And most political communication studies, they just take for granted that America is not a country where we would ever talk about something like propaganda, because that only happens in other countries.
Mm.
Yeah.
Paul's question, who gets to decide what points of views are allowed to be considered?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it depends on the specific outlet you're talking about. In higher education, the goal should be, as far as I'm concerned as a professor, to try and encourage students to decide for themselves, while also being a responsible intellectual and academic who recognizes the difference between actual arguments that have actual data and evidence, where someone is putting forward a good faith argument, versus people who are just saying things and expecting to be taken seriously. And so, you know, within that very broad, those very broad guidelines, I think that the goal should be in higher ed that students are doing this with guidance from professors. Now, realistically speaking, you know, it depends on where you're talking about, because if we're talking about social media, we know that the individual user is always filtering out information when people talk about things like echo chambers and how people can control the content themselves. We know with mainstream media that the journalist is acting as a gatekeeper. And so, you know, there's a lot of disagreement among academics about how good of a job journalists have done in terms of being critical of, for example, of official misinformation, that sometimes they maybe rely too heavily on official narratives. So I guess the simple answer is it depends. It's complicated. It really depends on what kind of venue you're talking about, because people may have a better or worse record of being pluralistic in terms of exploring different points of view.
Right. So I bet, do you collaborate quite a bit with your colleagues in the journalism department? It seems there would be an interesting partnership there.
So I have reached out to them, and they've reached out to me. I think, you know, moving forward, I could definitely do a better job of that. I'm looking forward to sort of doing a better job of it. What happens sometimes is that we get so balkanized within different, you know, departments at Lehigh, and also just in higher ed in general, that happens. Fortunately, that hasn't been as much of an issue here, because, like I said, they have reached out to me, and I've also talked to them. Now it's just a matter of us finding sort of time in our busy schedules to actually be more productive and more proactive.
Yeah. Lori's question, what's your opinion on the latest NYU case on anti-Semitism and how it was handled?
Say that again, sorry.
Your opinion on the latest New York University case on anti-Semitism and how it was handled.
Well, to be honest with you, it's been sort of a busy week following the sort of election stuff with COVID. So I'm not familiar with all the details of that case. It would be hard for me to speak about it unless she gave me a little bit more detail. I do remember seeing that in the news, but I don't remember a lot of the details of it. So rather than blow smoke, I need to sort of look into it a little bit more before I could be authoritative in my opinions of it.
Okay, there's plenty more questions for us to get to. John asks about commencement speakers. There are stories of some people being disinvited. Does this count as cancel culture?
Maybe, I like to take these on a one-by-one basis. So I guess it depends on the specific person and sort of what it is that they're doing. If somebody is putting forward a good faith argument with actual evidence and what they're saying is just seen as controversial, but they're engaged in a serious effort to further knowledge and discussion, then I think that might be an unfair thing to do, to disinvite someone. On the other hand, it depends on the person. So I think what you're talking about when you talk about like a commencement speech is that, that's this idea of platforming and deplatforming. The way I like to frame this, not just with regards to commencement speakers, but with regards to people who get a platform in the mass media or people who get invited to really large talks, sort of like this one and even larger ones, is that I like to be very clear with people that there's no such thing as a First Amendment right to be offered and given the privilege of a mass platform. Those things come with responsibilities. So it's up to us to sort of judge each one of the people who are given these platforms and whether we think they deserve them or not, and whether they should have the privilege of them. Because there is not a legal First Amendment right to be platformed with a mass audience. That's something that's a privilege. So I don't think people who have something serious to say and are actually making good faith arguments should be deplatformed necessarily. At the same time, I don't necessarily think that somebody should be guaranteed a platform if they're engaged in misinformation, propaganda, or if they're, if they're not putting forward a I think I lost you for a minute.
Yep, you're fine now.
Okay, sorry.
Yep, that's fine. Okay, so I think you were pretty finished with your point about the commencement speakers and the platform. And okay, Frank has a question about aren't most college professors Democrats?
That's true. From the survey data I've seen, most political scientists and most social scientists and most academics identify as Democratic. I think we want to be careful about recognizing what their partisan identification is, if they're willing to sort of identify that in a survey, which they have been, versus saying that automatically translates into like liberal or Democratic indoctrination in the classroom. Because my experience from talking with social scientists and watching people teach in the classroom, professor after professor, is that most academics are pretty moderate to liberal, moderate to centrist, and this is really more having to do with social scientists. I notice that that's less the case when you get into, let's say, business and finance programs, where oftentimes you see professors who are more conservative maybe, or Republican oriented. So it really depends sort of on what part of the academy you're talking about. And we also have to be careful about, how far that goes, because just because someone identifies as Democrat or Republican doesn't mean they're running their classroom in a way where there's Marxist indoctrination, which is what the language ends up being oftentimes when people in the media and in conservative media are complaining about liberal bias. Most academics I know, they try their best to not force their own personal politics down people's throats, although everybody has biases, of course.
Mm-hmm. Next question, how do supporters of the political correctness and cancel culture argument simultaneously justify censoring of protest narratives like Black Lives Matter or advocacy of any narrative that can be characterized as socialism?
I guess you could say that's ironic, but it would depend on the individual person, because there's sort of a lot of different discourses going on here. For example, I got into some hot water with this with the Harper's letter, because I said that they were criticizing Black Lives Matter, but it was really more like a couple of people who had signed the letter who had done that. Noam Chomsky was one of the signatories, and he emailed me unsolicited, maybe I deserved it, saying, I don't believe that. And there's nothing in the letter that said that. So, I guess it depends on like which specific people you're talking about. And I think this is one of the risks with something like this generic language about the cancel culture, because it gets used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people, and they may not have the same thing in mind. And that was sort of the point I was trying to make earlier about, it's some very anodyne sort of generic rhetoric and language that was in this Harper's letter, right? But what do we actually mean by that? Like the people who talk about cancel culture, oftentimes they don't agree with each other. So it really complicates things a lot, because maybe some people are doing that. They're criticizing Black Lives Matter and then saying we need to not be so Stalinistic about a PC culture or something, and that could be problematic.
Right. Let's see here. There's so many questions coming in. They're all great. Lori's question, how do you explain that in the 1960s, Lehigh had no protest, and when I was there in the late 70s to 80, the most liberal club on campus was the Young Republican Club, and now we're having this debate. Do you feel there is no slide towards liberal thinking?
Well, I can't speak to something I didn't see in the 60s, but I can only speak to what I see now, of course. And, I think that what we're seeing in the United States, and it's not just something on college campuses, is the mainstreaming of protest. And America is just a lot more liberal, or what would be defined as liberal today when you look at social issues, than it was in the 1960s. So there's just been a qualitative shift in the entire culture when it comes to issues of race and gender, and fighting homophobia, and just people being a lot more progressively minded today. So I don't think that's something unique to college campuses, although they are one place where there's a lot of protests going on, right? These recent Black Lives Matter protests have been engaged in by lots of different groups of people, not just college students. You're talking about 26 million people who say they've participated, and large numbers of them more progressive-minded sort of ideology when it comes to social issues, particularly related to race.
All right, I think you froze there for a little bit, but
Sorry.
we're back now. Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Lynn was asking, what is a taboo topic and who decides that?
Well, I guess in academia, the simple answer is that you have peers who, you have peer review in terms of the scholarship that people are doing. You have students who give you feedback on your classes. And if you're a professor who cares about that kind of stuff, then you take that seriously. And so you have peers within your department who vote on your tenure. You have external peers who write letters for tenure review. These external reviewers look at your publications and whether they're being worthy of being published, and students. So, I guess the simple answer for an academic is everybody does. Administrators sign off on tenure too. So, this is a complicated process with many, many steps, and it's really hard in higher education, particularly as an academic, to get to that point where you get through a graduate program, a master's, a PhD, you get through the publications, you get the tenure track job, you get actual tenure. And at that point, there's like an infinite number of sort of checkpoints where students, administrators, and fellow academics are all judging the merit of what you do. So that would be my simple answer in higher education, is that it's a pretty wide process.
And a follow-up question from John, any evidence of professors dialing down controversial topics to avoid rocking the boat in terms of student reactions?
That's something generally that I think all academics face. Most academics that I've talked to, they will tell you at some point in time that they feel like they may have softened a point that they wanted to make, or a criticism for fear, especially pre-tenure, of offending somebody. And I think that in general, like if you're an academic who cares about promoting, a diverse point, a diverse number of points of view, that this is something you should just be thinking about as a responsible academic in general, that you don't want to go so far off one direction, that you have now created a classroom where students feel like they aren't free to say what they want. So you should sort of be doing this yourself as an academic, policing yourself and being careful about sort of, how far you go in terms of making an argument or a claim, to the point where, that this sort of pluralistic thinking, I think it is something that should be guiding us. So it is something that the professors feel from students that is real, but it's also something that, we put on ourselves.
I like this question from Kevney. Shouldn't the racial left be the loudest voice for free speech norms and against cancel culture, given how repressed it's been in our society?
Well, yeah, I think one of the points that's been brought up with regards to Black Lives Matter and this discussion of the cancel culture is that it may be the case that now that, groups that historically were considered disadvantaged, repressed, marginalized, now that they're finally coming forward, it may not be an accident that we're hearing this discussion of cancel culture now, because you have all these marginalized groups who have struggled in academia, whether you're talking about critical race studies or gender, women's studies, and efforts to spotlight gender-based inequality, racial inequality, racism, racial oppression. Like, it may not be an accident that these things are now coming to the front at the same time that we're seeing this discussion about a cancel culture. And I would agree that, critical scholars should be at the forefront of pushing back against any sort of language that might be seeking to silence people for raising critical questions. I think that, as an academic, I've always had this approach where I think we should be at the forefront of these discussions of spotlighting problems in society, whether it be racial inequality or economic inequality, and whatever, what the negative impacts of those things are on democracy. So yeah, I would agree.
Okay, from Dennis, a real life question here. Wondering how to distinguish between good faith and bad faith debates. For example, do you think President Trump and William Barr are making a good faith or bad faith debate on voter fraud?
Well, if whenever I'm in doubt, the first place I start with, whenever I hear anything that doesn't sound quite right, but I don't want to dismiss out of hand because I haven't heard much about it, is the nonpartisan fact-checking groups. I think they have the best sort of record from everything that I've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. And what I mean by that is like PolitiFact, factcheck.org, Snopes does an okay job. I like to start in these places because I think they have a very good track record. And then, if you look at sort of what are defined as mainstream news sources, some might lean a little bit more right when you look at their editorials, like the Wall Street Journal, and some might lean a little more liberal, like the New York Times in their editorials. But they have a very good track record of factual reporting, especially when it comes to outlandish conspiracies and sort of challenging those and clarifying the record. So these are the places that I typically like to look. And, they've been very clear, the nonpartisan fact checkers and these major news organizations, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and so on. They've been very clear that the president has put forward a bad faith argument here. He's put forward a lot of claims. And these claims oftentimes really have very little to do with actual documented reality. And this has been pretty widely reported. So, I would say that that's a good example of a bad faith argument. And usually you can tell the difference if you have some kind of body of actual data or evidence regarding an issue. And when you put that forward to discuss it with other people, and when you have someone, and this is just a hypothetical, right? But you have people who just ignore what you're saying. That's usually a good indication that someone's engaged in a bad faith debate. If they're not willing to engage in the actual evidence and arguments and deal with the actual specifics, then you've got a pretty good indication of a bad faith debate or claim.
Right. Speaking of voting, we do have a Power of Your Vote event on October 22nd, another mountain talk that we're doing, and we'll put that link in our follow-up to this so you can sign up for that. One last question from Eddie. How has COVID enhanced or lessened cancel culture?
Well, how has COVID, the question would be whether there's a direct link there. I think maybe more than anything else, it's given people a time to reflect on what our values are as people. And so COVID has given people the time to, maybe people protest more. That's something that's been shown in surveys. They also have thought more about sort of their place in the world. So I guess if there's some kind of link here, all of the sheltering in place that was happening has given people more time to think about what our values are and what kind of values we want to have. Because this is when this discussion came up with the Harper's letter and sort of how pluralistic are we as a nation in our discourses. And so I don't think that's necessarily an accident. I think that it's given people a lot more time to think about sort of how we engage with other people. It's not always been good. You know, coronavirus has been very stressful, and it's oftentimes made people a lot more vigilant and dogmatic. So maybe that's another way that it's gotten worse in the COVID era, where there's a lot of stress people are under because of we're in a pandemic, right? The worst one in a century. And it's created a lot of sort of tension within families, depending on how seriously people have or haven't taken it. And so, you know, the cancel culture thing, you might have a lot of people who have canceled a lot of their Facebook friends or aren't talking to family members because of these fights. So I think it is a good opportunity for us to sort of think about how we engage with other people. Maybe we could do it in more productive ways if possible. And we should be doing that.
Right. Agree. Well, we are over our time. There's a lot more questions still left, some really good thoughts and thinking and questions. And, you know, obviously this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in and care about. I thank you so much for your time, Professor DiMaggio, and for everybody on the call. Again, we'll send out the recording and we will send some of these chat questions to Professor DiMaggio, and so he can answer those for us later.
I'm happy to answer them, and thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you.